Thanks everybody for coming here to the Realism and Restraint Conference of TAC and the Charles Koch Institute. Just a week ago, actually less than a week ago, the agenda of what we'd be talking about seemed pretty clear. We were going to have a long, hard slog to try to influence the world of ideas so that the next Republican president or Democratic president would be a realist and probably set the intellectual foundations for arguing against or disputing when President Hillary Clinton made bad moves, either for neoconservative reasons or for humanitarian interventionist reasons. Just wow. I mean, I think to our all shock, it's now like suddenly a completely different agenda, and rumors, appointments, a huge range of possibilities. So probably what everybody had thought of discussing and thought it would be part of what we'd be doing for years to come is out the window, and we're in a new situation. So our first, going to turn it over to Robert Mary, our first speaker. Robert has been a correspondent of the National Observer and the Wall Street Journal, later the chief executive officer of the Congressional Quarterly and the editor of the National Interest. He's the author of numerous books, a joint biography of the Alsop brothers, books on global messianism and American foreign policy, and most recently, Where They Stand, the American Presidents in the Eyes of Voters and Historians. And Bob, I can attest that I was there, was predicted with no ambiguity or hesitation in May that Donald Trump would be elected president. And I don't know if he was waffling on that a week or two ago. But anyways, Robert.
Well, Scott, I have to say I started to wobble a little bit towards the end. But I'm going to begin my remarks this morning defiantly with a cliche and say that this election represented the end of an era. We hear that a lot in political discourse. It's the end of an era. Actually, we don't have very many era-ending elections in America. In fact, we haven't had that many political eras. But I think this was one. And I think that it ended the post-Cold War era. By the way, I hate that term, post-Cold War era, because it doesn't define anything. It doesn't explain it. It just explains what the era wasn't. So let's define it. It was the era of the great globalization experiment, which just came crashing down a week ago today. It's the era of the end of history, of the Lexus and the olive tree, of open borders and free trade, of the triumph of the global financial elites, of the supranational organizations like the UN, the EU, and presumably the hemispheric common market that Hillary Clinton was talking about with those bankers, with its open borders and open trade. With the era of America, the benign hegemon, in the words of Tom Friedman. I had to correct him in my book, Sands of Empire. There's no such thing as a benign hegemon. The era of nationalism being marginalized and ridiculed. And I think it's now pretty much dead. That we know. What we don't know is what precisely is going to replace it. Or, and I think this is important, how much disruption, strife, and even violence is going to attend the transition from the old era to whatever is going to replace it. Because what's going on in America is part of a Western phenomenon. And the Western world is now, and is going to be for some time, in a state of transition, in my view. With America, the big question is, can Donald Trump lead us smoothly into whatever new era is going to emerge? And I consider that to be pretty much an open question. And I will cite 3 reasons why he may not be quite equal to that challenge. And it's a very, very big challenge. First, he has a rather disjointed, and I have to say sometimes incoherent, worldview, at least in terms of what we saw in his campaign rhetoric. In Syria, for example, he says we're going to concentrate on ISIS and not get screwed up with a lot of other things, trying to do away with Bashar al-Assad. And then he waxes bellicose, extremely bellicose, against Iran and says he wants to do away with the Iran nuclear deal. He says that he wants to end America's tendency to destabilize the Middle East, but he also says that when Iran detained some Americans who illegally ventured, inadvertently, I'm sure, into Iranian waters and were held by Iranian naval forces, that he would blow that vessel out of the water, presumably upon their own territorial seas. So it's not clear exactly what we have with this guy, and time is going to tell us. Second, I hesitate to bring up the temperament question, which got so much attention during the campaign, but let me talk just a little bit about what I'll describe as his type of intellect. I don't endorse those who denigrate his intellect, but he operates pretty much on the surface of things. And I think that he operates on the surface of things, and has, brilliantly. Certainly with regard to this campaign year, he was the only one who really saw so much of what was really going on in American politics. He alone understood the essence of what was roiling the heartland of America as 2016 emerged. He alone realized that the post-Cold War era was imploding upon itself and was ripe to be taken on. And only Trump understood the true implications of the immigration issue, in which so many politicians, in fact, I think just about everybody who's running for president, was interested in finessing that issue because they really weren't in sync with the American people. They didn't want to deal with it in 2016 because they only wanted to deal with it in a situation of control where they could finesse the question of amnesty and get it into a package before the American people could do something about it. And Trump is, I think he was right in that first debate when he said, we wouldn't even be talking about this if it weren't for me. But getting below the surface, he doesn't have a great deal of facility for that. The way I put it is he seems to lack the vocabulary for what I call explanatory political discourse, where you put things in perspective and explain what we're trying to do here in a way that can galvanize voters and sustain support. We'll see whether he does that with this particular gap in my view, but nevertheless, it's an open question. And it's a bit of a handicap. And finally, third, transitional periods are always highly emotional and raucous in terms of politics. The stakes are very high. And they're particularly high because the country is split down the middle on so many what I call definitional issues. Definitional issues are issues that get to the essence of what kind of a country America is going to be. We had this kind of a question at the early part of the Republic, and the politics were very intense and very nasty. We had this in the 1820s and 30s and into the 40s with Jackson and Clay and Polk. And the politics, again, were very nasty. We had it in the 1850s with slavery. We had it at the beginning of the Great Depression, and we have it now. Immigration being one of the great defining issues that we've got to have to work through, and it isn't going to be very easy. So we have a situation in which those who are clinging to the globalist era, and there are those who despise the globalist era, those who want to control immigration and those who consider that to be racism, those who believe that the radical Islamist fundamentalism essentially emanates out of elements of Islam itself, and those who think any such suggestion is bigotry and Islamophobia. And those who view Trump as necessary based on where the country was, and those who believe his election is very close to un-American. So these definitional issues are not going to go away, and they're going to get very, very intense. Very briefly now, I'd like to discuss the title of this panel is The Next President and National Interest. So 5 areas quickly that could fit under the rubric of national interest. First, to de-escalate the war of tensions with Russia and Putin. And if Trump does that, he will have done a great service in my view. I know the next panel is going to discuss this in more detail, but a great service to the country. Second, Syria, abandon this crazy notion that we can fight ISIS and we should fight Assad at the same time, which is a new military doctrine in perhaps all of human history and history of warfare, in which we say, the enemy of my enemy is my enemy. If you adopt that enough, you're going to be an isolated country. There's no way of getting around it. And it has the added benefit of easing tensions with Russia on that front as well. Third, the necessary and overdue assessment, review of what kind of military alliances we want to have in the post-Cold War period. NATO was a fantastic and brilliant, both in conception and execution, bulwark against Soviet Russia. Bear in mind that the Soviets had 1.3 million Soviet and client state troops on the edge of Europe, in Europe, ready to move if they had the guts to try it, which they would have had it not been for our nuclear monopoly. So it was a grand accomplishment of the West. Well, what do you do with NATO when you don't have that kind of a threat anymore? That's a good question, and no one else was talking about it. Fourth, the credibility on border security. I talked about that, and I would have to say that Trump's crudity when and sort of uncouth political rhetoric when he first went down that escalator was what gave the American people who were concerned about this a sense that they finally had a politician in front of them who was serious about this. And finally, trade. I've always been a free trader. I covered trade in Congress when I was a reporter for the Wall Street Journal back in the early 80s when trade was a hot item. I've written a biography of James Polk, who is probably the greatest free trader among our presidents. I've just completed a biography of William McKinley, who's probably the greatest protectionist. So I've really followed this whole thing through history. And what it tells me is that we've had great economic periods and bad economic periods under free trade, and we've had great economic periods and bad economic periods under protectionism. It's a question of what's needed at the time and how it's executed. Indeed, I would say that how these things are executed are going to be paramount in terms of our future and how we move into the next phase. And the big question is Trump up to it? We don't know, but I guess we'll find out.
Thank you, Bob. I think that was one of the more both balanced and incisive analyses of Trump that I've heard or read anywhere. So now we have Jim Pinkerton. To my left is been a contributor to Fox News since 1996. He is a contributing writer to the now very famous Breitbart News and a contributing editor of the American Conservative. Jim worked in the White House domestic policy offices of Presidents Reagan and George H.W. Bush, and in 2008 was a senior advisor to Mike Huckabee, and he's the author of What Comes Next, The End of Big Government and the New Paradigm Ahead, book published 20 years ago.
All right. Thanks, Scott. And Bob, I certainly agree that there are plenty of unknown unknowns. If Don Rumsfeld, if you're in the audience, I hope you don't mind me stealing your line. This topic this is the national interest, and I guess the American people judged in the election that just happened that the status quo was not serving the national interest. And I have a long piece on what I think might be Trump's foreign policy. It's in the magazine that's out there. I saw it out there earlier, and it's online as well. So rather than trying to pack 3,500 words into 7 minutes, I'll raise a couple other points and encourage all of you to take a look at the article if you're interested. I think a good deal of what has gone wrong with, let's just focus on foreign policy in the last few decades, has been what I call, and other people call, inbox-itis. And that is, if you're the Secretary of State or other foreign policy decision maker, you find yourself naturally just looking at your inbox and looking at what your loyal staff is telling you, and that becomes your policy. And in changing times, that can be a disastrous policy. For example, I think we sort of hit the nadir of an issue that I think probably animated a lot of the people in the American conservative magazine world, which is Middle Eastern policy, when Secretary of State Kerry said recently that he has the solution to the Syrian civil war: free elections. And the Syrian civil war is a terrible tragedy that's led to 500,000 people being killed and 5 million refugees. And I think common sense, as well as the recent experiences in Afghanistan and Iraq and the West Bank and elsewhere, kind of tell you that free elections in the middle of a war zone don't work out too well. If somebody had tried to say to General Grant and General Lee in 1864, why don't we just negotiate this through an election, it probably wouldn't have worked too well. There are just times when somebody has to win. And then you can think about political arrangements, including possibly elections. So as I think about what led Secretary of State Kerry, who's been a loyal pillar of the Beltway for the last 40 years, to think, oh yeah, I have the answer, free elections, I'm reminded of a famous story, joke, cynical bit of wisdom about Washington, and that is, here's what happens to a new Secretary of State. And this jokey scenario is completely irrespective of party. The new Secretary of State comes in and says, I want to make big change and do big things. And the permanent bureaucracy at the State Department says, yes, sir, whatever you say, Chief. And they come back, a month later with an options paper. And it's option A is unilateral first strike and nuclear war against the Soviet Union. Option B is unilateral surrender to the Soviet Union. And option C is exactly what we're doing now. And so the bureaucrats say, okay, Chief, what'll it be? And the distinguished Secretary of State says, well, is there anything else? And they say, yep, we're on it, Chief, we're on it. So a month later, they come back with a new options paper, A, B, and C, that it would take a rabbi and a Jesuit collaborating to see the difference between the new option paper and the old option paper. And any of you who are familiar with how cabinet departments work, we all know that you can a Secretary of State or a Secretary of anything can spend his or her tenure just doing nothing but chasing down sort of phantom options and choices. And in fact, this story kind of emanates from the actual real-world experience of Richard Nixon's first Secretary of State, William P. Rogers. He's sort of a forgotten figure now, but he was Secretary of State from 1969 to 1973. He was a very distinguished, handsome fellow with a great resume. He had been President Eisenhower's Attorney General. He had been Richard Nixon's personal lawyer in the 60s. I mean, he had everything going for him when he came into Foggy Bottom. And yet, he was, by I think almost all accounts, ineffective as Secretary of State because he just couldn't sort of outthink his loyal staff of FSOs and other stakeholders. Meanwhile, as we all know, and this is more hopeful, Henry Kissinger, who was a smart guy and a realist, was over at the White House saying, well, look, I don't want to just simply go to the Paris peace talks and negotiate with the North Vietnamese. That's not going to get us anywhere. The only way to deal with, for example, Vietnam is to deal with Russia and, oh, by the way, China. I have to get myself and the president to Moscow and Beijing and we'll figure out at the summit how to deal with this and, get a peace with honor and a decent interval and so on. It was cynical, Morgenthau-ian realpolitik, but it worked pretty well at least. So what Kissinger had going for him that Rogers didn't is that Kissinger was smarter and could bring his own human capital to the equation and not just depend on what the bureaucracy came up with in terms of options and choices. And he did things completely differently, and it was a tremendous success. At least I think so. And so as I think about a hypothetical President Trump, I think he has that sort of let's get to the real point here capacity. I think he's taken a lot of heat for saying such radical, crazy things as, I want to get along with Putin. I'm going to test him. We'll find out. He gave a great speech, which I refer all of you to, at the Center for National Interest back in the spring, where he said, we're going to find out. We're going to test him. But you can see that we're never going to solve the crisis in Syria with free elections among Syrians or with, a no-fly zone or something. The only way it could get solved, if it gets solved, will be some sort of entente, a la the way that Nixon and Kissinger did it 40 years ago. And so I'm reminded of the famous historical anecdote from ancient times when young Alexander the Great was confronted with what they called the Gordian knot. It was sort of the Rubik's Cube of his era. And they said, Alexander, you're so smart, why don't you untie this? And he said, the hell with that, so he pulled out a sword and just cut it in half. Problem solved. And again, I don't know what will happen. None of us do, obviously. But I am optimistic that a President Trump will think, okay, look, the existing system exactly the way it is has generated the results exactly the way it is. And so more of that will generate more of that. And so let's try new things. And I think there's enough precedent there in history to point to that we might just get some pretty startling successes in the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. So it's a lot to chew on. I don't know whether to be horrified or reassured that the Secretary of State is going to come up against his State Department bureaucracy. But we'll find out. William Ruger is Vice President for Research and Policy at the Charles Koch Institute. He was formerly an Associate Professor of Political Science at Texas State University. He earned a PhD in politics from Brandeis and is the author of several books and essays in such venues as International Studies Quarterly and Armed Forces and Society. And he is a veteran of the Afghanistan War and an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve.
Thank you. So, as probably everyone in this room, maybe not our friend in the front with the hat on, we were pretty surprised by what happened last week. And I thought about how would this change my remarks. And I think the hallmark of realism is that it really shouldn't change our kind of advice to the president, because states have permanent interests, and therefore these kind of the messages of realism should apply to whoever's in office, because it's the best way to provide for those interests. This kind of focus on American safety, on American economic prosperity, on preserving the American way of life here at home, these are the things that all presidents should be aiming for. And so what I'm going to say would apply almost equally to President-elect Trump as it would have to President-elect Clinton. Now, what I think should happen, of course, is that we need to make American foreign policy great again. And by that, I mean that we need to return to some of the adages of the old that served this country so well. Like I said, it's a laser-like focus on what America's interests are, on its safety, on avoiding some of the kind of excessive idealism of the I know Bob won't like this, the post-Cold War era, which we might call the era of primacy, or as Barry Posen of MIT says, an era of liberal hegemonialism, in which the United States was aggressively going out to the world to maintain its power and to try to spread and promote values, but without understanding the constraints of international life and the constraints of a liberal democracy. So things like nationalism, things like the fact that other countries get a vote and have their own objective or irreducible interests themselves. These are hard constraints that liberal hegemonialists, unfortunately, did not think enough about, or about the constraints imposed on our own system. We're a liberal democracy. We're not well suited for empire, and that's a good thing. But that means that there are real limits to what American foreign policy can accomplish. And I think that that's something that for most of American history, our foreign policy leaders have recognized. And I think we got drunk in the post-Cold War era. I mentioned Fukuyama, right? This notion that the United States could take advantage and propel the end of history if it hadn't already arrived. This was, I think, a product, again, of that kind of drunkenness after the Cold War, and it was ill-fated. I think we also need to remember, and I hope the president will remember this, because he mentioned that old phrase that William Graham Sumner, I think, first introduced, but it was especially prominent in FDR's rhetoric, which was the notion about the forgotten man. And I think the next president, if I were to give him any advice, I would think about the forgotten men and women who have to fight these wars and pay the costs, and the American taxpayer that has to pay the cost in treasure. So I think it's really important that we think about what really matters to that family in Wisconsin or Michigan or Pennsylvania that was unhappy with the status quo. If we have to go to war, you have to remember, is it worth it for that family in Des Moines? Will it make our country, their lives, more safe if they have to go to war? And unfortunately, I think for most of our recent history, you can't make that claim. I mean, how many people sleep better knowing that the Baltics are part of NATO? Seriously, right? We have an Article 5 guarantee with these countries, and they're very nice countries. I'm sure they're wonderful. But the fact is that they don't make us safer to have. In fact, quite the opposite. It risks more problems with countries like Russia to have these commitments. So we need to think really hard about these commitments, and we need to think really hard about when we need to go to war. I mean, it's kind of trite at this point to say the Iraq War was a disaster, but did we really think a lot about how this would actually impact Americans? I mean, think about the 4,000 Americans that were killed in Iraq. Think about the trillions of dollars expended that are going to have to be paid by the American taxpayer. Either they already did or they will in the future because of our commitments to veterans, because of the many disabled, nearly 1 million that have filed claims, because of the debt we took on. These are all things we need to consider when we go to war, and I think, unfortunately, that's not been the case over the last 25 years as much as it should have been. And I think that speaks to another piece of advice I would give, and this is something that most people who seek power don't have this virtue, but we need more humility about our ability to control the world or to predict the future. I think that, as Eugene Goltz of the University of Texas at Austin has said, he said that how can we understand the rise of ISIS when we can't even in our own country understand the rise of Donald Trump, right? So if it's a real knowledge problem that we have, right? We have to kind of reference Hayek here, right? We have local knowledge about things that are close to us. But even in our own country, it's difficult to predict. Imagine trying to do this abroad. So, I was in Afghanistan, and, you're trying to understand, this tribe and this tribe and this sub-tribe and that sub-tribe and these players. It's very difficult, particularly without the kind of deep cultural knowledge that is necessary to understand this. And again, it's hard here. And you think about not just the kind of cultural knowledge, but the knowledge of the ability to actually make things happen as you'd like. We can't do nation building well here at home, and I don't think we ought to. Government is not well designed to promote good economic outcomes aside from maintaining the rule of law and protecting property rights, things like that. But we don't know how to cause growth outside of that. So how are we going to bring government in a box to Helmand, as General McChrystal did, and not have it turn out what he said was a kind of bleeding ulcer, right? Governments in a box don't work, particularly in places we don't really understand. So I think we need more humility. I also think, given that need for humility, I think Trump really needs to stay true to what he said in his first major foreign policy speech that he gave at the National Interest. One of the lines in that speech, which, like Bob said, it's not kind of clear where he stands, because even in that speech, it was like 2 or 3 speeches in one. It wasn't clear, which direction we really thought was going to happen or take. But there was really one, I think, insightful passage where he talked about this issue of experts. And he talked about how there are lots of people with really fancy resumes that we really should think twice about bringing back, because of the fact that they had these fancy resumes, and yet the status quo has not been working, and they've been responsible for that. And so I think that it would be wise of Trump to look outside of the same types of people that have been running this country's foreign policy. And if we're not careful, we'll run our country into the ditch. And so I think look to some outsiders. And I don't think that's a bad thing, especially when the insiders haven't been working well for this country. It's not to say that you should abandon people who have some experience or certain bona fides, but be very careful about just relying on the same old, same old. And then lastly, I would say, we need to listen to what Bruce Jennison called the pretty prudent public here. And this pretty prudent public is not excited about the status quo, not happy about the status quo. And so they need to, it would be useful for them to kind of think about, well, what is the American public really in favor of when it comes to foreign policy? And so we at the Charles Koch Institute, in conjunction with the Center for the National Interest, recently did a poll after the third debate and before the election, asking people basic questions about their views of American foreign policy. And some of the findings were quite surprising even to me, who thought that there was a disconnect between elite opinion in Washington about America's role in the world and what the public thought. The gulf was actually wider than I expected. So here are some of the findings in brief. One is that a majority of Americans polled, 52.5%, believe that U.S. foreign policy over the past 15 years had not made the United States safer. Over half. Only 14% thought U.S. foreign policy had made us safer. Also, more than half thought we had made the world less safe, with only 12.6% believing that we had essentially made the world safer and been a force for good. The other thing is that 80% of the American public, 80%, it's hard to get any American, to that many people to agree on anything, right? Even, mom, apple pie, and Chevrolet. And yet 80% of Americans said that the president should be required to seek congressional authorization before committing the U.S. to military action in foreign countries. That's a very different public or a very different attitude than what elites have in this town. When it comes to defense spending, a plurality of Americans think that defense spending should stay about the same. And only about 36% think that the defense budget should be increased. And then lastly, Americans are very reluctant about going abroad. They're more realistic than elites are. So what we have is a situation in which only 24% of Americans think the president should use the military abroad more than it has been, and 51% say the next administration should use the military less than it has since 2001. And when it comes to even specifics like Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria or Yemen, Americans generally don't favor a greater American commitment. So I think President-elect Trump should listen to new voices and to listen to the public so that he doesn't forget the forgotten men and women. Thank you.
Thank you. That little fact of 1 million U.S. veterans of the Iraq War having some kind of disability is it's a kind of forgotten fact in the foreign policy conversation, but it's a really salient one. And the people in these communities, which are all over the place, though probably not so much in the blue enclaves won by Mrs. Clinton, have not forgotten it. I actually want to ask Will whether we should be yet alarmed by some of the names that are being boosted from the Trump campaign, considering what Donald Trump said about foreign policy resumes and so-called expertise. Should we be alarmed about what we're hearing so far in terms of names to be the major movers of the incoming administration?
Well, it ain't over till it's over, right? So who knows? I mean, we don't know who's officially going to be appointed. But certainly, I don't think the United States, I don't think President-elect Trump will have satisfied the people who voted for change if he picks some of the people that were involved so heavily in President W. Bush's regime. And this is a candidate who I thought was going to get crunched in South Carolina when he started attacking Republican foreign policy. I mean, there were these moments there where he even was talking about President Bush and responsibility for 9/11, and I thought, how will the Republican base accept this? And yet he won. And so I think that shows you that even within the Republican Party, there's a lot of disenchantment with where we've been. And so there need to be new conservative voices that are authentically conservative, authentically classical liberal, that will bring these new ideas to the table. And again, hearken to a different set of thinkers who understand this Hayekian notion about the problem of knowledge, as opposed to looking to those thinkers who want to fulfill that kind of end of history.
Yeah, I don't know how we make that happen. It's like the campaign has to continue. I was curious, and I'm going to want to open to questions from the floor shortly, but when Bob opened by saying that we had definitely passed from the era of the American benevolent global hegemony and the Lexus and the olive tree and the end of history, it's pretty clear that most of the say Beltway foreign policy establishment, believes that era should continue, and most of the Republican establishment candidates had staffs that believed in that, and Hillary certainly believes in that. And I kind of wonder, objectively, if one wanted that era to continue, could it, or is it like, have structural things changed so much since 1990 or 2000 that even if you had, Jeb Bush and James Woolsey and running things with dictatorial power, they could have America do that in the world?
Well, let me say that I don't think we have seen in our history such a gap as we have now in foreign policy discourse between the elites of America, of both parties, and the broad spectrum of popular sentiment as reflected in the election. But as I also said earlier, it's a close game. The country is very evenly split. But I have to say, I really do believe that this era is over. And if Trump doesn't end it, then his successor will, because the failures of American foreign policy of the last 15 years of two presidents of both parties have been so abject that the American people are not going to let that continue.
Yeah, I mean, I shudder to think what would happen if we have a failed presidency. I don't put Obama in that category particularly. I do put W in that category. But there's certainly the possibility that Trump could fail hugely. And the divisions which are so intense among political tribes I mean, it could become like a lot worse.
Isn't it more likely that he'll fail if he gets distracted by a foreign policy adventure that really he hadn't?
Oh, yeah. No, I think there's no, John Bolton, I think there's an op-ed he wrote in the New York Post, just recently saying, laying out all these conditions which lead to confrontation with Iran. And I think, there's no surer way of having Donald Trump fail than to, Iran is actually kind of a de facto ally right now against ISIS and, against Islamic extremism because of Sunni Shiite divides and things like that. So, Donald Trump wants to make an enemy of my enemy, but I don't know who around him conceptualizes things like that. But I really wish that somebody was saying, no, don't make an enemy of, the enemy of your enemy is not your enemy. But I'm a little bit alarmed, to be honest, by what I hear from transition rumors. If anybody wants to ask us questions, I guess there's a microphone there, and you can get in line. I hope there's. I want to hear from the guy in the red hat. I love the red hats, but I don't want to hear only from him.
Oh, okay. Augustus, Arizona. I'm a longtime immigrant to this country. The question I have for you, gentlemen, is if you were the president-elect, who would you hire as our next Secretary of State?
I'd probably hire Jim Webb.
I mean, one of the problems with this that we have right now, those of us who favor a very different foreign policy approach than we've followed over the last 15 or 25 years, is that the restraint bench is pretty thin. And that's one of the reasons why it's really important for people like Chris Lane sitting in the front row and Mike Dash at Notre Dame to develop more realist scholars who could contribute to these debates, but then those types of scholars need to get into the fray at some point. And that's the other thing that a Trump presidency could really help in the long run, is to give people who have different views that don't have those fancy resumes yet, to give them some experience in government so that the next time there's a Republican presidency, or even a Democratic presidency that wants to embrace more restraint, that these people will have some of that experience. So it's not just the top jobs that matter, it's also some of the lower jobs. And I would encourage people who have a realistic mindset to want to help our country, to step up to the plate in its time of need and to try to participate in this process. Even if they didn't love Donald Trump, I think that they can do something for their country.
Yeah. I would agree that the realist bench is a little thin these days. There really hasn't been a realist presidential administration since Bush 41. And so that means that a certain number of the training, the cadres that would get created in subsequent administrations have not gone to realists. One comment, though, for any aspiring realists out there, and this might put me a little bit at odds with Bob and perhaps Will, and that is, I think that the realists across American history were also economic nationalists. I think what's happened, and I view this as unfortunate, is that in the last couple of decades, the realists, the Scowcroftians, if you will, have pretty much decided to throw in with the free traders on economics. And so you get a realist foreign policy and a de facto a globalist economic policy. And so, as Scott was saying, and I think we all agree, it's kind of hard to imagine the United States succeeding at another, say, Iraq war in the future, in no small part, and because a country with 4% of the population of the world and 19 or 20% of the GDP is a little bit hard-pressed to be policeman of the world. And so whatever foreign policy you have in mind, you're better off with a strong economy. And I think the evidence is kind of overwhelming that if, for example, the Chinese make 90% of the world's computers, including 100% of the computers at the Pentagon, from what I can tell, we got a real vulnerability there. We can be the most realist, practical, pragmatic, cynical, real politicking foreign policy ever, and still just inevitably find ourselves in a confrontation with China over something. Yeah. It just happens. And I would really hate to think that we've gotten ourselves in a situation on economics where we're so strategically attenuated that we just wake up one day and discover that all our satellites don't work. So I think that that's where the realists have to address a little bit better than they have. It's not just the Congress of Vienna. It's also sort of the Hamiltonian approach to how do you build a strong economy. And sir, as to your question about the Secretary of State, you know, I don't know who would be the ideal Secretary of State for President Trump. But as my little anecdote about William Rogers and Henry Kissinger reminds us, it really is the team. So yeah. I think inevitably, as you see in the only two appointments that I think have been announced, which is Reince Priebus and Steve Bannon, you see a pretty heavy sense that there's two different groups there, which in the Doris Kearns Goodwin team of rival sense is kind of healthy. So I suspect that we won't have a full picture of what the Trump foreign policy looks like until you see the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of Defense, UN Ambassador, and so on. Let me get, before get to the next questioner, I want to just say I would like to hear Andy Bacevich's name talked about as a brilliant scholar, former high-ranking military officer, has written more incisively and boldly about foreign policy than just about anyone in the last 10 or 15 years. Lost his son in Iraq, fought in the first Iraq War, and you know, his name should be in the mix. I mean, John Bolton. Give me a break, please.
My name is Mitsuo Nakaya, Reagan Foundation. Bill, I agree with you 110% of what you said today. Speaking of SOS, I think it's going to be outsider, like you mentioned, who can bring something new to the table. But the Trump is a kind of a guy who values loyalty over experience. So even Rudy Giuliani comes to my mind. He's a stranger to foreign policy, but he could bring something new to the table, and that's my comment. No question. If you guys can make a comment if you want.
Yeah, I don't find Rudy Giuliani the most alarming of names. I lived in New York when he was mayor. He kind of took a lot of neoconservative foreign policy advice when he was doing his presidential run in 2008. I don't think that defines him. I think he could learn, and I don't think he's, I think he's likely to look at more things with a fresh mind than some of the people with foreign policy experience in the Bush administration, and often the wrong sort.
Thank you. I spent 40 years in the State Department, and I've been reading National Review, which I have more or less deserted for you all, thanks to Rod Dreher, for most of my adult life. And National Review is characterized by a strong anti-communist position, a more or less realistic view of the challenges we faced for that period, and a continuing disdain for the State Department. There's almost nothing in National Review that mentions the State Department isn't snide, and you all, on the whole, refrain from that. But let me point out that expertise is extremely important. The ability of administrations to develop it in the State Department is weak. The Pentagon gets the money. I was having dinner with an ex-ambassador last night, and we were reviewing the bidding, and we weren't very pleased about a number of things. When I look at the people who need to be heard, two names pop to mind: Tom Pickering. Chaz Freeman. I think you may have done something with Chaz in the past. These are people with enormous depths of on-hand experience which, however good scholars are, cannot be replaced by mere scholarship. The two best candidates for president in my recent years would have been Robert Gates and George Shultz, and the Republican establishment should have done for them what it did for Eisenhower. Reagan reached out their hands and said, "You, sir, are somebody we want to promote," to Eisenhower, and, "Oh, you're a Republican? So much the better." And bring in people who are highly qualified, not the group we had this time, who were, for the most part, laughable. I do not know how we can encourage a more serious approach to foreign policy. Figures were cited about what Americans believe on foreign policy. I was back in Oklahoma, which I have the honor to spring from during much of the Trump campaign. Nobody was talking about foreign policy. I don't think that the figures on foreign policy amount to very much of a serious understanding of the profound American view. And we have a very intelligent congressman who comes up and speaks about some very interesting things. That vote on Georgia was telling. But most of the time, Congress reacts in an entirely predictable and unhelpful manner when it comes to foreign policy. And his example on Georgia was highly indicative of that. So I'm very pleased to see so much anti-neocon, realistic view expressed in an important publication like American Conservative. But I do urge you to value the expertise in the State Department and elsewhere, which needs to be developed and acknowledged as we move forward.
Thank you.
Can I say something? I really appreciate that comment. It seems to me that ultimately it's irrespective of who Trump brings into these top jobs, and I agree that there are some names that are very disturbing, and if they become a cluster, it would be extremely disturbing. But ultimately, it depends on the president. I covered Congress in the early Reagan years. I covered tax and budget legislation, so I was very much wrapped up in the whole Reaganomics, Kemp-Roth imbroglio. And it is true that Reagan did, in bringing George Herbert Walker Bush into the vice presidency, putting Jim Baker in as his chief of staff, Richard Darman coming in under the steam of Jim Baker, et cetera, that he had people in that administration who were not sympathetic to his agenda. And yet he managed to manage them in such a way that he got his agenda. So ultimately it's going to depend on the president. Reagan also put in a disaster Secretary of State and got rid of him after 2 years. So let's look to Trump and see how he handles this, and if his first decisions are adverse, let's see how he manages to control the agenda in the early months and first couple years, and if he doesn't get what he's looking for, let's see whether he makes those personnel decisions. But it's a crapshoot.
Yeah, I mean, he hasn't been bad at these decisions. I mean, I guess the critical one, and I didn't know the right one, was choosing Pence, and I think Pence worked out really well for him.
Yes. One topic I haven't heard yet this morning concerns what's normally the elephant in the room, the question of Israel and American foreign policy. Do any of you have an insight on where Mr. Trump may take us there? Apparently he's a good friend of Bibi Netanyahu, but he's also seemed to indicate other things than doing Israel's bidding. Where do you think we're going to go?
I think he's probably not going to try to push Israel towards a two-state solution, but I think that may be over anyway. His son-in-law, who he's very close to, is publisher of the New York Observer and pretty much a Netanyahu or kind of Zionist. And, I personally think that, Israel is making its own bed and not a comfortable one by not encouraging the Palestinians to have their own state, because it's going to move into unambiguously an apartheid situation. But Obama tried, I think, to move things in the right direction and just came up against his own party and American domestic politics. And I see no inclination that Trump is going to do anything different. I would think that, maybe there's a break if Israel wants to start using its Air Force, and whether there's enough breaks in that direction. its Air Force in.
Yeah, I would just add that Middle East peace defined as Palestinians and Israelis is about the ultimate in inboxitis. You know, the last 10 or 15 presidents have tried to do something, and they've all failed. And so it does sort of suggest that a pragmatic 45th president would find other things to worry about.
Hi. So I had a question about our relationship with Saudi Arabia. Do you see that changing at all significantly under a Trump presidency, and do you think that that should change substantively?
I couldn't really hear that.
Asked about Saudi Arabia, and should it continue to have a special relationship with the United States? Will it change? Should it change?
With Saudi Arabia?
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, I mean, one thing to say might be that back to these phrases we've used today, the enemy of my enemy is not necessarily my friend, and I think that's important. And I want to give a shout out to Daniel Larison's work at the American Conservative talking about Yemen. He was one of the people paying most attention to this,
yeah.
and I think that's a real problem that the next president is going to have to get a handle on is that relationship, and obviously it's not doing the United States any favors in the public relations area to be complicit through our support militarily of things like what happened with that pretty massive bombing that killed hundreds of Yemenis.
Yeah.
I would just make one point at Saudi Arabia, and that is to make a pitch again for economics as the substrate to foreign policy. The rise of fracking and other energy sources, which I think President Trump will be a strong advocate for, very much vitiates the need to overly propitiate the Saudis. We don't need their energy the way we thought we did 30 or 40 years ago, and that's quite healthy for Americans.
So I hate to cut off before the last questioner, but we're at 10 o'clock, and we're going to break for 15 minutes, and then there's a new panel. So thank you very much for your questions and interest.